It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The kind of night where the world seems to exhale after a long day, everything quieting down, settling into stillness. The smell of freshly cut grass hung in the air, and a gentle breeze whispered through the trees, making the leaves rustle softly, almost soothingly. I was on my way home, taking the same route I always did. The streetlights hummed overhead, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched across the empty road. I was lost in my thoughts, barely paying attention to the world around me. It wasn't until I turned onto that dark, narrow stretch of road that I noticed something was off. The air felt thicker, heavier somehow, like the atmosphere was pressing down on me. I shook the feeling off, blaming it on fatigue. But as I walked further down the road, I saw him. At first it was just a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. A man, tall and slender, dressed in a long black coat that seemed to absorb the light around him. I couldn't make out his face, but something about him made my skin crawl. He stood perfectly still, almost unnaturally so, as if he were a statue. I told myself to keep walking, to ignore him. It was just some guy, nothing to be concerned about. But then, as I got closer, he turned his head toward me, and I froze. His face was shrouded in shadow, but I could see his eyes, cold, empty, and dark. And then he smiled. That smile. It wasn't right. It wasn't human. It was too wide, stretching across his face like a grotesque mask, the corners of his mouth curling upward in a way that defied anatomy. His teeth were sharp, unnaturally pointed, gleaming in the dim light like those of a predator. Panic began to rise in me, my instincts screaming at me to run. I quickened my pace, trying to put distance between us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were still on me, that smile still etched onto his face. I didn't dare look back. I was almost past him when I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was following me, moving with a slow, deliberate stride. His smile had widened, if that was even possible, and his eyes were locked onto mine. Fear surged through me, primal and unrelenting. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the pavement as I raced down the street. The sound of his footsteps quickened behind me, keeping pace with mine. No matter how fast I ran, he was right there, gaining on me with every step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The thought of what would happen if he caught me was enough to push me beyond my limits. I could feel his presence behind me, could almost feel his breath on the back of my neck. I knew deep down that this was no ordinary man. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist in our world. The lights of my house appeared in the distance, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, my muscles screaming in protest. I reached the front door and nearly crashed into it, fumbling with my keys, my hands trembling so violently that I could barely get the key into the lock. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the lock clicked, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, everything was silent, the only sound the blood rushing in my ears. But then, as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, a scratching, like nails dragging across wood. My blood ran cold, and I slowly turned my head towards the door, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. There, just on the other side of the door, was that same smile. The man was standing right outside, his face pressed up against the small window, his grin wider than ever. His eyes bored into mine, empty and soulless, and his mouth began to move as if he were speaking. But no words came out, just a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I tried to put distance between myself and that door. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, smiling, as if he knew something I didn't, as if he were waiting for something. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next, the window was empty. I waited, my breath held, expecting him to reappear, but nothing happened. The night was still once more, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile, those sharp teeth, those empty eyes. I sat in the corner of my room clutching a baseball bat, waiting for him to come back. But he never did. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination, that I had been tired, maybe a little paranoid. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had seen was real. That the smiling man, or whatever he was, had truly been there, and that he was still out there somewhere, waiting for another unsuspecting victim to cross his path. I never walked down that street again. I avoided it at all costs, taking longer routes just to keep from passing by that spot. But it didn't matter. The fear stayed with me, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that there are things in this world that we can't understand, things that defy explanation. And every now and then, when the night is quiet and the air is thick with the smell of freshly cut grass, I think about that smile, that wide, unnatural grin that haunted my dreams for so long. And I wonder if, someday, he'll come back for me. Because deep down, I know that the smiling man isn't gone. He's just waiting. It's been years since I first stepped into that chamber, and yet the memories still haunt me. I was one of 5 political prisoners, handpicked by the state for a secret experiment, an experiment that promised us freedom if we survived. Freedom. What a cruel joke that word became. The day we were taken to the lab, they told us it was for the greater good, that our sacrifice would change the world. They sealed us in a chamber deep underground, a place so isolated that it felt like we were buried alive. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of metal and antiseptic. There was no way out. The walls, thick and unyielding, trapped us in a tomb of cold steel. They said we had to stay awake for 30 days. At first, it didn't seem so bad. We were given rations, water, and a promise that if we succeeded, we'd walk out as free men. We talked to each other, told stories, tried to keep our spirits up. But as the hours turned into days, the weight of what we were doing began to sink in. Sleep became an elusive dream, something we longed for but couldn't reach. By the 5th day, things started to change. Our conversations grew darker, more paranoid. We could feel it creeping in, the madness that comes with sleep deprivation. Our minds started to betray us, turning against us in the most horrific ways. I remember seeing shadows move in the corners of my eyes, whispers that weren't there. My thoughts, once clear and rational, became jumbled, distorted. It was on the 10th day that everything truly unraveled. One of the others, Nikolai, he was the first to break. He started screaming, a sound so guttural, so primal, that it chilled me to my core. He screamed and screamed until his voice gave out. And then, in the silence that followed, he did something I'll never forget. He began to tear at his own flesh, ripping his skin with his bare hands. The sight of it was grotesque, blood pooling on the floor, the raw, open wounds exposing the muscle beneath. It was like he was trying to escape his own body, to claw his way out of the madness that had taken hold of him. We tried to stop him, but we were too weak, too far gone ourselves. The fear had taken root in all of us. We watched as Nikolai continued to mutilate himself, his eyes wide with terror, his face twisted in a grimace of pain and desperation. I could see the horror reflected in the other's eyes, the realization that we were all heading down the same path. As the days dragged on, the chamber became a place of unimaginable horror. The walls seemed to close in on us, the air growing thick with the stench of blood and decay. We barely spoke anymore, each of us retreating into our own minds, our own personal hells. I could feel my sanity slipping away, like sand through my fingers. I began to see things that weren't there, figures lurking in the shadows, voices whispering my name. I knew they were just hallucinations, but that didn't make them any less real, any less terrifying. Then came the day when they opened the chamber. The researchers, the ones who had watched us from behind their one-way mirrors, finally stepped inside. I remember the look on their faces, pale, wide-eyed, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. I could see the guilt in their eyes, the realization of what they had done. One of them, a young man with trembling hands, tried to speak to us, to calm us down, but we were beyond saving. The madness had consumed us. We were no longer men. We were something else, something broken, twisted. I could feel the rage boiling inside me, the hatred for the people who had done this to us. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, screams, blood, the sensation of my hands around someone's throat. When I finally came to, I was lying on the cold floor, my body bruised and battered. The others, they were dead. I could see their lifeless bodies sprawled across the chamber, their eyes staring blankly at nothing. They took me out of that chamber, but the damage was already done. The things I saw, the things I did, they'll haunt me for the rest of my days. I was a man once, but now I'm just a shadow of who I used to be. The experiment, the so-called Russian sleep experiment. It was a failure, a cruel, inhumane test of the limits of human endurance. I've been told that the records were destroyed, that the experiment never officially happened, but I know the truth. I was there. I lived it. And every night, when I close my eyes, I'm back in that chamber, back in that nightmare, reliving the horrors over and over again. There are some lines that should never be crossed, some doors that should remain closed. The Russian sleep experiment was one of those lines, one of those doors. And now, it's a story whispered in the dark, a tale told to scare children. But for me, it's not just a story. It's my reality, my living nightmare. And no amount of time will ever erase the horrors of that chamber, or the madness that took hold of us all. I never believed in the supernatural, not really. I thought the world was made up of facts and figures, of things you could see, touch, and quantify. I had seen a lot in my years as a doctor, suffering, hope, loss, but nothing that couldn't be explained by science. That was until I met her, until I met the expressionless. It was a cold, unforgiving winter night, the kind where the wind cuts through your coat like a knife, and the sky is a leaden gray, pressing down on the city like a shroud. The hospital was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that sets your nerves on edge, makes you feel like something is just waiting to happen. I was working the night shift, making my rounds through the dimly lit halls, when the first whispers started. I overheard two nurses at the end of the corridor, their faces pale, voices trembling. "Did you hear about the new patient? The one they found wandering the streets?" One of them asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, they say she doesn't speak, just stares. They're calling her the expressionless." The other replied, casting a nervous glance down the hall. I brushed it off as idle gossip, something to pass the time on a slow night. But as I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. There was something about the way they spoke, the fear in their voices, that unnerved me. Later that night I was called to the emergency ward. A nurse told me they had admitted the woman, the expressionless. She was found wandering the streets alone, her clothes torn and dirty, her eyes vacant, hollow. There was no ID, no record of who she was or where she came from. She was a mystery, one that didn't sit well with anyone who had encountered her. I entered her room with a sense of trepidation. It was like walking into a crypt, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The room was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners like something out of a nightmare. And there she was, sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me. "Miss?" I said, my voice steady despite the unease gnawing at me. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Slowly I walked around the bed to face her, and when I did, my breath caught in my throat. Her face was blank. Not in the sense of emotion, but like a mask, smooth and featureless. Yet her eyes, they were the worst. Wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead, as if she was seeing something far beyond the walls of this world. There was something in those eyes, something ancient, something that didn't belong here. "Can you hear me?" I asked, taking a step closer. Nothing. Just that unnerving, dead stare. I reached out to check her pulse, but as my hand hovered over her wrist, I felt a sudden intense cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes from the air, but a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into my very soul. I pulled back, shaken, and stepped away. There was something deeply wrong with this woman, something I couldn't explain. I felt like a fool for even thinking it. But there was a darkness about her, a darkness that seemed to reach out and wrap around me, suffocating me. The following nights were the worst of my life. Every time I entered that ward, the air grew colder, the shadows darker. The nurses refused to go near her room alone, and those who did often came back pale, shaken, muttering about an overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air. And then the disappearances began. At first it was just one patient, an elderly man in the room next to hers. He was weak, frail, the kind of patient you expect to pass away peacefully in the night. But when we checked on him during the morning rounds, he was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets undisturbed, as if he had just vanished into thin air. We searched the entire hospital, checked the security footage, but there was nothing. It was as if he had never existed. The staff was on edge, whispering about curses, about ancient evils, about things that should not be disturbed. The disappearances continued. Patients who were too weak to even stand were found missing from their beds, no trace of them left behind. Each time the rooms would be empty, silent, as if the very essence of life had been sucked out of them. And through it all, she remained, the expressionless, sitting in her bed, staring into nothingness. The fear among the staff grew. Some quit, refusing to work another night in that haunted place. Others simply avoided her room, their eyes wide with terror whenever they spoke of her. But I couldn't leave. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening, what she was. Was she the cause of the disappearances? Was she some sort of portal to another world, as some of the more superstitious staff whispered? Or was she simply a lost soul, trapped between worlds, drawing the living into her void? It was on the 5th night that everything came to a head. I was making my rounds, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in my stomach. The hospital was silent, too silent, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The lights flickered as I approached her room, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted like living things. I paused at her door, my hand hovering over the handle. I could feel the cold radiating from within, a cold that seemed to freeze the very air around me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But I had to know. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small window high on the wall. And there she was, sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me, as always. But this time, something was different. I could feel it. A shift in the air, a sense of impending doom that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The cold was unbearable, like being submerged in ice water, my fingers numb as I reached for the light switch. As the light flickered to life, I gasped in horror. The bed was empty, the sheets tossed aside, as if someone had just been lying there. But she was gone. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening, and then I felt it, a presence behind me, cold and malevolent. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I was frozen in place, my feet rooted to the spot. She stood there, in the doorway, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. Her face was the same, blank, emotionless, but her eyes, those eyes, they were filled with a darkness so deep, so overwhelming, that it swallowed me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as she stepped closer, her gaze never leaving mine. The cold intensified, wrapping around me like a vice, squeezing the life out of me. And then, in an instant, everything went black. When I woke, I was lying on the floor outside her room, the cold still lingering in my bones. The lights were back on, the hospital bustling with activity as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The expressionless was gone, vanished, just like the others. No trace of her remained, no record of her ever being admitted. The staff avoided the subject, pretending as if the last few days had never happened. But the fear lingered, unspoken but palpable. I left the hospital not long after that, unable to shake the feeling that something dark and ancient had taken root in that place, something that should never have been disturbed. The expressionless was gone, but her presence, her darkness, would haunt me for the rest of my days. Some things are best left unknown, some doors best left closed. I learned that the hard way. And now, as I sit in the silence of my home, the memory of her eyes still burned into my mind. I can only hope that whatever she was, wherever she came from, she never returns.